No one could have imagined the sky could be this merciless. In the silent, endless emptiness, only the waves of hot air seemed to shimmer. 6 children lay side by side, clinging to life by the thinnest of threads, too exhausted to even open their eyes again. The oldest, Emma, tried to wet her cracked lips with the battered flask in her hand, but she was too weak to even wipe away the dried tears on her sunburned cheeks. Next to her, the youngest, Max, had fallen silent. He'd stopped crying hours ago, and now there was that eerie look on his pale face, the one that waits between life and death. A few steps away from the children, a shadow appeared, on a tired horse barely moving through the sand. There was a woman whose face told the story of many hard years. Laura Weber was a farmer who'd lost everything long ago. Her husband and only son had died in a tragic attack, and she'd had no choice but to survive in her pain. She'd kept to herself for a long time, shut her heart to everyone, and learned how to live alone. But that day, a glint of sunlight off a piece of metal from an abandoned car in the distance caught her eye. For a moment, she hesitated, then couldn't resist her instincts and nudged her horse forward. As she got closer, she saw the kids lying on the ground. At first, she thought it might be a trap. It wasn't easy to trust anyone out here. But if a mother's heart ever loses its sense of mercy, it never really goes back to the way it was. Laura quickly got off her horse. She'd been guarding the water in her flask carefully, but when she saw the kids' cracked lips, she didn't hesitate to share the last drops. Emma, the oldest girl, barely managed to open her eyes. There was both fear and hope in her gaze. As Laura knelt by her side and gently poured water onto her lips, Emma whispered in a hoarse voice, "Max first. He's so little." Without a second thought, Laura gave the youngest child the first drops of water, then helped the others. Water meant life out here. But at the edge of hope and death, sometimes life starts with just a single drop. But what really gnawed at Laura was knowing she couldn't just save these kids and leave them here. No one had ever told her what could happen to a family out here. But now she had to become the hero of this story. Her conscience and the mother in her that she thought she'd buried long ago was alive again. Still, just as she let herself think they might be safe for a moment, she heard hoofbeats in the wind, faint but growing closer. Her eyes darted to the horizon. Hearing someone approach out here usually wasn't a good sign. Laura stood up and moved the kids behind her. She had no weapon, but she wasn't afraid anymore. At that moment, 3 shadowy men appeared. Their faces were dusty, and the guns in their hands made it clear they weren't here to help. The leader of the group, with a sly smile, got off his horse. Well, a mother's kindness. That's hard to find around here," he said, his eyes lingering on the children, a threat Laura could feel in her bones. Laura took a quiet breath. The instincts that had pushed down her fear 15 years ago now just told her to stay standing. But the children's trembling eyes gave her strength. "If you're looking for help, you came to the wrong person," the man said harshly. "But you don't really have another choice, do you?" In that moment, Emma grabbed Laura's hand, and Laura felt her fingers shaking. The other kids, Anna, Lena, Ben, and Paul, stared wide-eyed in silent fear. With courage born out of desperation, Laura stepped forward. "They're just kids," she said in a firm voice. "If you touch them, you'll regret it." The men hesitated for a moment, surprised by the darkness and determination they saw in her eyes. But one of them, grinning cruelly, raised his gun. Just then, more hoofbeats came from the distance, faster and with more purpose this time. The moment froze, cold as ice. Who was coming? Another threat or a savior? Laura's fate, the lives of 6 children, and the split-second decisions about to be made slipped through her fingers like grains of sand. She stared at the horizon, breathless, alone with questions she had no answers to. And under the burning sun, the line between salvation and disaster was growing thinner with every passing second. As the sun slowly rose on the horizon like a burning ball, the fear in Laura's heart was turning into a dark sense of resolve. The men standing in front of her were waiting in a cloud of silent tension, their fingers resting on the grips of their guns. The leader's name was Michael. His jet-black hair and shadowy eyes carried the look of someone who knew everything in these lands came with a price. The other 2 men exchanged small grins. After all, it was just a lone woman and a bunch of dying kids. They had every reason to think this would be easy. But there was something in Laura's eyes, a warning about what might happen if any of them dared touch the kids. As she felt Emma's little hand in her own, she remembered the dark corners of her own past, when a woman who's lost everything can become truly dangerous. The children gathered quietly around Laura. Max was still breathing unevenly. Lena's eyes were closed, but her fingers clung tightly to Laura's skirt. Michael spoke up, mocking. "Look, this isn't a place for good-hearted people. If you're out here on your own, it's because you deserve it." His eyes flicked from Laura's water flask to the children. "Maybe you owe someone something like these kids." Laura took a step closer, tired but unbroken. "I don't owe anyone anything," she whispered, her voice thin but steely. "But if you make the wrong move here, you'll pay the price." Just then, the sound of hoofbeats started to grow closer behind them. Through the cloud of dust rising from the sand, a new group appeared. 4 men on horseback, their guns openly on their belts, eyes sharp as they scanned the area. One of them broke off and moved to the front. His face was weathered from years in the sun, his gaze both threatening and worn. His name was Thomas. Even Michael and his men hesitated when they saw him. Thomas took a look around as he walked up to face Laura. "Is there a problem?" he asked, calm as ever. Before Michael could answer, Thomas put his hand on his gun. "You all know how things work out here. Nobody hurts a woman or a child. Not on my watch." Michael laughed a short, tense sound. "Your rules mean nothing to us, Thomas. Out here, the only law is who's fastest with a gun." Then, turning to Laura, he sneered. "You think you're going to save these kids? We can give them a chance, better than starving and dying out here." Laura felt a chill inside. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice steady. Michael narrowed his eyes and said, "These kids, will take them with us. Maybe put a few to work, maybe someone else will. But out here, dying isn't the only option." The kids huddled together behind Laura, staring at Michael in terror. Just then, Thomas stepped forward and raised his hand. "No one's touching the kids," he shouted. The air was electric. For a second, it looked like things could end in gunfire. Everyone held their breath, waiting for someone to make the first move. But something unexpected happened. There was a faint rustle from a nearby bush. Laura glanced over, as did Michael and his men. The silence was broken. Laura leaned further over the children, pressing Emma's head against her chest. Thomas's men reached for their guns. Right at that moment, another figure stepped out from the shadows, a weathered old man, walking slowly, followed by a young woman carrying a sack full of medicine and food. The old man nodded to Laura. "We came to help. For the kids," he said simply. For a moment, the tension seemed to break, but there was a dark look on Michael's face. He whispered to his men, "They can't mess with our business. Either she gives us the kids, or they all stay here." For a split second, Laura realized she was about to make one of the hardest choices of her life. Leaving, giving up the kids, letting their fate fall into these men's hands. No, she couldn't do it. On one side, Thomas and the strangers offering help. On the other, Michael and his ruthless crew. And in the middle, tearful children, trapped between surviving and being forgotten. Laura's heart, mind, and hands trembled all at once, but there was a light in her eyes. The pain she'd carried for so long was turning into strength for someone else's salvation. She wasn't going to back down. No child, nobody should ever be left to die like this. Her eyes burned with determination. "The kids come first," she said quietly, her voice firm. "They live first. I'll do whatever it takes after that." The tension was so thick it could snap at any second. Everyone held their breath, the fear of what the next moment would bring hanging in the air. And once again, the sun beat down on the sand, casting a shadow that could rewrite the fate of everyone standing there. Tension on the sand was stretched tight, ready to snap at any second. The kids around Laura clung to her, hoping she could save them, but they were still scared of the shadows cast by the threatening men. Thomas and Michael locked eyes, each side waiting for the other to make the first move. The arrival of the old man and the young woman changed the balance for a moment, but there was still a look on Michael's face that said things could turn violent any second. Ben was the first of the kids to break the silence. In a shaky voice, he said to Laura, "Please don't leave us." At that moment, Laura remembered what happened to her own son years ago. There's no pain like a mother's pain. Now, these children's fate hung on whatever choice she made next. Michael started walking forward, slowly pulling his gun from his belt, his eyes fixed on Laura. "I'm going to ask one last time. Give us the kids and walk away. Otherwise, Nobody here gets out alive." The threat in his voice was cold and sharp, like a knife in the air. Thomas immediately stepped in front of Laura and the kids to shield them. "If any harm comes to these kids, and even one person makes it out of here alive, you'll never set foot on this land again, Michael." His voice was clear as steel. His men reached for their guns too, and Laura realized they were on the edge of something explosive. The youngest, Max, still wasn't moving. Laura kept checking on him with her eyes, while watching every move the men made as they got ready to fight. Just then, the old man Martin pulled a small bottle of water and some bread from his sack. The young woman, Lena, supported the kids while also keeping an eye on the men creeping closer. "We have to find another way. Not with violence. These kids have seen enough death," Martin said, almost pleading. But you could see in Michael's eyes there was no turning back. His gun was up, finger near the trigger. That's when Emma suddenly stepped forward, surprising everyone. "You don't want to hurt us. We're just lost. Our mom and dad are dead. Laura saved us. Please." Her voice shook, but there was a spark in her eyes, the pride of a girl who refused to give up, even at her age. For a split second, Michael's eyes softened, but he hardened again right away. "Life's tough, little girl. Everybody picks their own path." Suddenly, gunshots rang out in the distance. Everyone turned their heads in shock. A new group was approaching fast from just beyond the Sandmore men, heavily armed. The dust cloud behind them sent panic through both sides. Thomas leaned into Laura and whispered, "Get ready. This isn't over." Martin gathered the kids, and Lena moved up next to Laura, saying, "Quick, we have to protect the kids." Michael and his men looked at the new group, suddenly rattled. They thought they had everything under control, but out here, danger never just comes from one place. At the front of the newcomers was a big, tough-looking man named Paul. He didn't wear a sheriff's badge, but just his presence was enough to make everyone nervous. Paul shouted at Michael, "This is our territory. No one touches kids, especially not helpless ones, without our say." For a second, Michael's face went pale. Thomas seized the moment, drew his gun, and shot Michael's weapon right out of his hand. The gun hit the ground. At the same time, Martin and Lena pulled the kids behind Laura. Chaos broke out, dust, shouting, people scrambling everywhere. Paul and his men quickly overpowered Michael and his crew. Some of Michael's men ran, others dropped their guns and gave up. Laura rushed to check on the kids. Max was still barely conscious. Emma and the other siblings were scared, but also looking at the new arrivals with hope. Paul turned to Laura. "Things are bad here," he said, "but we're here to protect you and the kids. We need to get out now. This place isn't safe anymore. The kids need medical help right away. You'll have to trust us." Laura had learned not to trust anyone, but now she had no choice. With Martin and Lena's help, they got the kids onto horses. Paul and Thomas guarded them as they rode out. Laura held Emma's hand, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a tear slip down her cheek. Maybe she wasn't so alone anymore. But the danger wasn't over. Michael, now disarmed, watched them from a distant hill. On his face, anger and the fire of revenge burned. This wasn't over. For Laura and the children, the real fight was just beginning. As the group moved on like a caravan, dusk's chill started to set in. Exhaustion and fear mixed in the children's eyes. Laura kept scanning their surroundings with every step the horses took, making sure Emma and Max were okay. Even though he was old, Martin led the way, while Lena circled around the kids like a protective shield. Thomas and Paul stayed at the rear, always alert in case anyone tried to follow or attack. Everyone had the same worry on their mind. Michael hadn't given up. He was still out there, tracking them. The kids swayed like shadows on the horses' backs. Every now and then, Laura glanced at Emma and tried to give her a small, reassuring smile. But you could see the worry written all over her face. Max was burning up with fever and breathing weakly. Sarah had her head on Emma's shoulder, drifting in and out of sleep. This journey was leaving new marks on all of them. But Emma, stronger than most kids her age, hugged her siblings tight and kept whispering, "We just have to hang on a bit longer. Laura won't leave us." Suddenly, a scream echoed in the dusk. Paul threw up his hand, stopping the group immediately. Everyone held their breath. Thomas quietly got off his horse and signaled for silence as he moved ahead. Laura tried to keep the kids close together, making sure the littlest ones were safe in the middle. Lena wrapped her arms around the two smallest kids. Martin clenched his fists, straining to hear any sound in the dark. Every snap of a twig in the woods or rocks put everyone on edge. Then, out of nowhere, a shadow appeared among the trees. It was Michael. His eyes were blazing with anger and obsession. He'd come back, flanked by two men. "Did you really think you could get away?" he shouted, gun drawn and pointed straight at Laura. Paul immediately stepped in front of her. "Take one more step and you'll regret it," he warned. Michael just laughed and fired. His bullet hit a tree. Chaos broke out instantly. Thomas and Paul charged back at them. Guns went off. Horses reared up. Lena dropped to the ground with the kids and shielded them, while Martin covered them with his own body. Laura didn't even think. She just rushed to Emma's side. Those few seconds of chaos felt like hours. One of Michael's men was shot and dropped to the ground. The other tried to run. Michael moved closer to Laura, gun raised. At that moment, Emma, summoning all her strength, threw a rock she found at Michael. It hit his arm, making him drop his gun. Paul jumped on Michael and pinned him to the ground. Thomas shouted, "It's over." Lena gathered the kids back up and hugged them, sobbing. Laura grabbed Max and checked his pulse. He was burning up. "Quick," she said, "this boy is dying. We can't wait any longer." Paul and Thomas tied up Michael and made sure he couldn't escape. Laura lifted Max onto her horse and took off in front. Martin and Lena hurried after her with the other kids. The whole group pushed themselves to the limit, racing toward Laura's farm in the darkness. Even in the night, Laura could feel Michael's angry, hateful glare burning into them from behind. No one spoke a word until they reached the farm. Laura fought back tears as she dealt with Max's fever. Once inside, Lena quickly brought water and clean sheets. Martin dug out old medicine. Laura knelt by Max's side and prayed with all her heart. Emma gathered the others in a corner and, for the first time, broke down and cried. While Paul and Thomas kept watch outside, Laura tucked the children in and made sure they were warm and safe. Later that night, Max's fever finally went down. Laura rested her head on his chest and took a deep breath. She turned to Emma, who stood quietly by the door, and gave her a gentle smile. "You're safe now," she said. But there was still fear, still a shadow in Emma's eyes, because they all knew the danger wasn't really over. Michael and his thirst for revenge still haunted them, like a ghost. And Laura, who was rediscovering what it meant to be a mother, knew this was just the first round of the fight. In the silence of the night, this group coming together like a new family held on to each other a little tighter. Because when dawn broke, they all knew a new challenge was waiting for them. By the end of the night, the whole farm was wrapped in silence. Laura sat in a corner, listening to the kids breathe as she stayed up all night. Max's fever had finally broken, but he still couldn't open his eyes. Emma, sitting with her siblings beside Laura, seemed to finally let herself relax, drifting in and out of sleep as if she was safe with a mother's comfort for the first time. Lena spent the night in the kitchen boiling water, while Martin kept watch at the window, afraid a stranger or Michael might show up in the yard. Paul and Thomas patrolled outside until sunrise, circling the farm like guardians for Laura and the kids. When the first sunlight touched the ground, things started to stir. Paul spotted dust clouds in the distance. "Someone's coming," he said, worry in his voice. Laura rushed inside to gather the kids together. There was nowhere left to run or hide. For the first time in years, the farmhouse doors were protecting such a fragile, crowded little life. The newcomers weren't just Michael's men. The tracks mixed horse hooves and footprints. One man especially stood out. He wore a dark coat and was flanked by two others, one tall, the other younger and uncertain. As they got closer, Paul reached for his gun, but Laura recognized the man from the window. It was Daniel, a former lawman whose name Laura had heard many times in town years ago. They used to say he hadn't returned since Laura's husband was killed. Daniel's gaze was hard. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice cold but commanding. Paul answered, "We were attacked. We're here for the women and kids." Daniel was silent for a long moment. Then he explained they'd been tracking Michael, who'd been wanted for hurting women and children in the area. For the first time, Laura felt a flicker of hope maybe. Finally, the law was on their side. But things are never that simple. Michael and his last man were still lurking at the edge of the woods, eyes fixed on the farm. As Max slowly recovered, Sarah and the other kids were starting to remember how to smile. But Laura couldn't shake her worry. "These things aren't easily forgotten," she told Martin. "A mother will risk anything for her children." but there's still evil out there. Daniel asked to talk to Laura privately. They walked out into the chilly morning sun behind the house. Laura, he said, if the kids stay here with you, you might be putting them in danger again. Michael still wants you and the kids. Laura shook her head. I know, but don't ask me to leave them. My past is gone. Theirs is just beginning. If I have to, I'll fight for them until my last breath. Daniel's face showed a mix of sadness and respect. Then let's all be ready. Michael never gives up easily. Just then, a scream came from the back of the farm. Lena had been playing with one of the kids when Michael's last man cornered her. Paul and Thomas ran over instantly. There was a short struggle. Thomas quickly took the man down. Laura realized she would never be able to let her guard down, even for a moment. Every time they thought they were safe, a new threat appeared. That evening, the farm looked like a little fortress. Everyone kept their weapons close, eyes sharp. The kids huddled together around Laura. Emma quietly asked, Laura, do you think we'll ever really be free? Laura hugged her tight and said, I can't promise you that, but I promise I'll fight for it every day. You're not alone anymore, and neither am I. That night, for the first time, Laura closed her eyes with a mother's sense of peace. But outside the door, Michael's shadow still lingered. And in the whistling wind, you could tell another storm was coming. Tomorrow would be the day that changed everyone's fate. The darkness of night still lingered, and an odd silence hung over the farm. Everyone looked like they were asleep, but no one truly felt at ease. Laura sat up through the night by the children's side, while Martin and Lena took turns watching out the window. Paul and Thomas, guns in hand, quietly made rounds around the farm. It felt like even nature itself was holding its breath, sensing the final storm was near. Just before dawn, a gunshot echoed from far away. Laura jumped up in alarm. The children clung to each other in fear. In that moment, Michael and his last man had slipped through the edge of the farm. There was a crazed, determined look in Michael's eyes. He had nothing left to lose. He wanted nothing but revenge. Daniel and Paul quickly took up their positions, but Michael was more dangerous than ever. He was ready to come after the kids, Laura, the farm, everyone. A brief, muffled fight broke out in the yard. Gunfire tore through the morning stillness. Michael's man was shot and dropped to the ground. Michael turned toward Laura and the kids. At that moment, Emma stepped in front of her siblings, standing between them and Michael, her eyes full of courage beyond her years. Michael aimed his gun and shouted, "You took everything from me. Now it's your turn." Laura threw out her arms to shield the kids. When she met Michael's eyes, all the pain and anger she'd carried for years faded into a strange calm. "That's enough," Laura said, her voice ringing out across the yard. "This hate won't bring any of us peace. If you want, shoot me. But you're not touching these children." For a split second, everything was silent. Michael hesitated. Then suddenly, he lunged forward. At that exact moment, Paul fired a single shot. Michael dropped to the ground, finally burying his rage along with his lifelong search for peace. Suddenly, everything stopped. The fear, the noise, the chaos gone, leaving behind a deep silence. Laura dropped to her knees, wrapping her arms around the kids. Emma clung to her, sobbing. Paul, Thomas, and Daniel lowered their weapons once they were sure there was no more danger. Lena and Martin brought out water and blankets for the children. As dawn broke over the farm, it felt like the ghosts of the past were gone and the first shoots of a new life were starting to grow. Daniel said he needed to go back to town to handle official matters. "The state might want to take these kids somewhere else, but I can see they're safe here with you," he told Laura. Paul and Thomas decided to stay at the farm to help. Lena and Martin had become part of the family, too. Days passed. Max and Sarah were soon running around with bright, happy laughter again. Emma, with her sense of responsibility and courage, became Laura's biggest support. Over time, the farm became more than a shelter. It became a real home. At the end of each day, Laura would sit out on the porch, the kids gathering around her, all of them learning what hope and family truly meant together. The pain of the past hadn't completely vanished, but everyone was ready for a new beginning. Laura thought to herself, sometimes the greatest losses open the door to unexpected miracles. Because as 6 children found a way to live, a spring also began to bloom in her long-buried heart. And for the first time, a morning full of real hope dawned over the farm. If this story touched you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and become a part of our stories. Because sometimes, The kindness of a stranger can change an entire life.